Someone can fact check me on this, but I'm pretty sure Abridge is probably the fastest growing health tech company ever. So back in 2023, you guys had, what, 20 employees?
About
20 employees, not very much revenue. And then recently this year, the news allegedly reported that they raised at over $5 billion in valuation with a whole lot more revenue. So I can't even imagine what, in that short 2-year period, the organizational chaos that you had to deal with in terms of building your team. So super excited to dive into that with Zack today. But before we get started, raise your hand if you have heard of Abridge and know what they do. It's a vertical AI company. Okay, why don't we start there? Tell us what Abridge does.
Sure. So maybe start with the status quo before you put Abridge into the equation. So in healthcare, doctors spend about 2 hours doing clerical work for every 1 hour of direct patient care. So there's a whole lot of reasons why we got into this situation. I think some part of it is that we live in a litigious society. Some part of it is that we've got a very complicated financial structure behind the health system with a lot of misaligned incentives. And some part of it is that we've had, I think, a lot of, well-motivated attempts to digitize healthcare. But that has created a system in which now we can keep adding and enforcing more and more documentation requirements, and almost no one has an incentive to remove them. So we've gotten to a world where a doctor will see a patient for 15 minutes, and after that visit, they need to draft a history of present illness, a physical exam, an assessment and plan. They have to document informed consent. They have to compile a page of paperwork if any prior authorization is required. They have to write referral letters. They have to select from drop-downs. They have to apply visit diagnoses. They're responsible, if they're in primary care, for doing their own coding work. It's going to ultimately determine if they get paid for the care that they provided. So we're in this world where the amount of administrative work has just ballooned in healthcare, and a lot of our attempts to insert technology haven't made the problem better, they've made it worse. What Abridge does is we sit inside the doctor-patient conversation, and the insight that our CEO had when he approached me 7 years ago was that healthcare is all about conversations. Conversations are the entry point to deploy new technology in healthcare. And if we get inside the conversation, if we could hear everything that the doctor and the patient are saying, that's like the dark matter of medicine. That's this vast ocean of kind of like missing information. And if we're sitting there, you can kind of do everything. You can help patients understand what's going on in their care, but you can also start automating all of that paperwork for the doctors, and eventually you can start helping doctors maybe more proactively to provide better care. We might divide this journey on the provider side into like a three-act saga of like save time, save money, save lives. And that first step, saving time, is really about automating note writing. So putting doctors in a situation where they've already got a note that is aware of the entire patient chart prior to the visit, everything that was said during the visit, and everything is pulled out and structured and written. And maybe the doctor will want to change how something's written, or they'll want to correct some detail, or there's something that was going on in their head that they forgot to vocalize. But when you start off with a first draft that's 95% of the way there, that's a lot less work than staring at a blank screen. So we built and deployed this product. Initially, 2 years ago, it was really the history and the assessment were our initial targets, deployed at the first health system. Now we're kind of covering the full complement of note-taking sections and starting to expand into automating a lot of the billing-related clerical work.
Let's start from the beginning. Maybe let's just go to 2023. How was the engineering team set up back then, between research, between platform, between product, and what does it look like today?
Set up is a generous description of where we were 2 years ago. I wouldn't say it was that. I would say 2 years. So I had a funny relationship. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon, relatively new to operating in a company. I've had to learn a lot along the way. In the initial few years of the company, I was really, I I think you've probably seen faculty members that have this relationship to AI companies where they're maybe 1 foot in, but not really operating. And that's certainly where I was. So I was kind of like research was taking place in all these different avenues there. There was a group of ML folks inside the company, but there was also this relationship with Carnegie Mellon where I was able to get money to fund my PhD students, and we were able to engage in collaborations. When I kind of crossed over, things were kind of balkanized. There was one individual who was managing kind of machine learning scientists and the one ML ops person that was there. And then there was one engineering manager who had under him kind of a mobile engineer, 2 full stack engineers, and soon after one DevOps engineer. A lot of the infrastructure had been set up by a third party, and it was kind of a little bit crazy, normal startup stuff. I originally stepped into kind of chief scientist role, which makes sense given my inexperience, I think, operating at the time. So it was I was used to managing applied scientists in the research lab, and so that's how things started off. But you had this precarious thing that we started kind of turning that team over really fast, and we were starting to have ideas. I think I didn't start off with a mental model of, oh, product discovery is done by these people, and then the modeling is done by these people. I was approaching it more thinking like a researcher, just thinking first principles and not really having a lot of my brain energy given over to delineation of roles and responsibilities. So I think I kind of found myself in this area of deciding what the features would be, seeing if we could build them from a machine learning standpoint, pressure testing them with customers, and then marshaling kind of engineers to build it. And so I think I sort of maybe started inhabiting some of the roles related to the responsibilities of a product function and an engineering function without realizing it. And maybe a few months later, the way we realigned is we centralized the builder organization under me with product, engineering, and science. Initially, and I think maybe one thing that I probably held on to too long is I think I had a little bit of a bias coming from being used to being a professor, working with a lot of scientists, having a large lab, to thinking that I could skate much further than I really could with having every single scientist in the company reporting directly to me. So I tried pulling that off probably until, probably about maybe 8 months or a year longer than I should have. And I learned a lot of hard lessons, maybe about creating real clear lines of accountability, creating system of distributed agency, and putting in those leaders of each function, even the ones that maybe I felt like I had some special knowledge of, and giving them a lot more room to run.
Well, one other concept I want to talk about, and we talked about this earlier this week, is the skill sets required to build AI features is changing. It's fluid, right? Not only is technology changing and developing very quickly, but the type of talent you need at prototype stage versus at scale in production might change as well. So how do you think about recalibrating if the right people are in the right roles, and how frequently do you do that?
All the time. I mean, I think the entire industry is, I think, being remade before our eyes, and I think if any of us think we figured it out, then we're toast. So I think right now, even I think a lot of the conventional boundaries are things that are constantly being re-legislated. What are things you ought to buy? What are things you ought to build? Where is the line between what ought to be part of platform or infrastructure? What ought to be part of product? I think machine learning is this weird kind of new fourth leg of the stool, or AI. I think once upon a time, we were living in this world where the way you create an AI capability is you went out, step one was harvested an enormous amount of data that was perfectly representative of the input-output behavior you wanted. And then you had a team of people, and their background was probably machine learning PhDs, people who were real strong on the modeling side. And that was how you got your V1 of a capability. I think now we're in this world where, depending upon what you're trying to build, it might be that the way to tackle it is through modeling. It might be the way to tackle it is through some kind of orchestrating or weaving together the capabilities that are available off the shelf from third-party foundation models. And I think just as often, you either don't know a priori before you start tackling the problem. So you need to now think about how do I handle cases where like new product features, you're not sure at the outset which is going to be the right kind of line of attack to be able to build it. And that might mean a totally different phenotype of builder who's able to build it, or where it'll change even for the same feature within the life cycle of a product. I think a common thing that we're starting to see is the case where you can prompt your way to a V0 that crosses some threshold of viability, and it kind of solves the chicken and egg problem, where it used to be, well, how do you build a feature if you don't have any data? And how do you get the data if nobody's actually engaging in that kind of interaction pattern? I think now we're often seeing these cases where you could prompt your way to a V0 that you could put in some people's hands in a tightly supervised setting or with appropriate guardrails in place. Now you can induce a certain kind of behavior pattern inside the product, and you could design the product with the right kind of like capture of feedback, that then you're able to like harvest instances of real world behavior that you can now distill and improve upon to get like a better, cheaper, faster model through like the whole, whether it's supervised or reinforcement fine tuning kind of sort of paradigm of capability development. So you might have even the very same feature, which ought to be built a different way at prototype stage. And that pattern itself isn't something so fundamentally new that I think like infrastructure is something that the infrastructure you need to take a new product line 0 to 1 is often not the right one to scale to millions of people. But maybe it's like new in this particular context.
Yeah.
And something that I'll also add is just like what is a product engineer now in a company where so many of the features you're building are AI powered is, I think, something that we're all rediscovering. And I think too many of us have maybe a bit of a bias to think like the AI capability should be built by the dedicated AI team. And I think now we're living in a world where actually, the hard part isn't necessarily, or the specialized knowledge isn't necessarily how to build the feature, but maybe it's often the statistical thinking is more required in how to evaluate it. And to think about how you configure an organization where all of your product engineers are empowered to be able to build features and to develop workflows and to be able to ship them, but to still have the right checks and balances where, there's some kind of protocols around how to register that you're shipping a new AI capability. Who is it that has sufficient kind of maturity and knowledge about potential risks and harms, and kind of the statistical thinking to be able to reason about evaluation, who's able to step in and participate in that process. So I think all those lines are moving, and it's an exciting time to be building.
Can you share an example of some of the things that you look for when you're interviewing candidates for product engineering? What are you looking for in terms of their background? Any kind of high signal questions you might be asking them?
Generally or specifically like as relates to AI?
Specifically as it relates to AI.
I think some of the obvious things, or I just push people on how they use AI in there. I think there's sort of like two sides. One is like, how do they use AI to build? And one is, what do they build with AI tools? Or like, what do they build that is AI powered? I think that's often quite revealing to just spend a lot of time in an interview. I think we should even get to a point where, like, it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is how do we, like, I don't think it should just be like me in a final round where I'm still like kind of a gatekeeper in hiring who's like starting to push people. Like, are they kind of looking ahead? Are they thinking, are they incorporating AI tools into their workflow? I've thought like, what I'd like to do is, I think eventually we should start having some kind of more mature thinking about how do we explicitly test for these abilities. Like, I think we should be living in a world where we are giving people coding challenges that they could not possibly do within the allotted time without relying on AI tools, and let them use AI tools to complete tasks, rather than just giving them conventional coding interviews and then kind of like catching them cheating when they happen to be using an AI tool. So, I mean, there might still be a place for that, to say like, no, you're not allowed to use your calculator. But I think, this is a case where like this particular performance enhancing drug is like here to stay. And this is just like part of how we build now. And I think we should just accept that this is the world we're living in, and actually test for how effectively people use those tools.
I love it. It's like the modern stress interview where you just like give someone almost an impossible task and see how they handle it. Or use a performance-enhancing drug,
Yeah.
as you mentioned.
Hit 900 home runs.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so one question I get a lot
On the Alps.
is how do you approach stack decisions across the life cycle, right? So, for example, when is pay per token good enough versus when do you need your own infrastructure or fine-tune model? How do you think about that?
I'd say that in the first place, different companies are at different stages, and I think there's companies that are trying to get off the ground, and there's companies that are so mature and their business is so stable that they're going out there being like, do I need to build my own version of S3 to like shave my margins? I'd say that just like a age-old original sin of and I remember it from my like brief time out here in SF before I went to grad school is like worrying about cost or worrying about scale before it's actually a problem that you have. So I'd say that early days of a company, probably you should be just 100% driven by like what's giving you the best product experience, and not worry about like I think if your biggest problem is that you've created a compelling product that like people can't stop using, and but you've done it in a very inefficient way because you're making too many model calls, I think that's a great problem to have. Like if you've got scale, then you'll have enough data and you'll also have enough money that you could hire someone, even if you don't already have them, who's capable of fine-tuning or distilling those models. And even if you don't figure it out, the model is going to be like 1/10 the cost in 18 months. So I'd say that in the first place, shouldn't worry too much about cost. As for like what's going to give you the best performance, that's a hard question to answer in generalities. I think we're living in an interesting moment that, like, if I were to look back to just like when, like, machine learning circa 2014, circa 2015, it felt like we converged really quickly. Like we started off, everyone who was messing with neural networks for the most part was messing with some version of multi-layer perceptrons. People, you started developing a bunch of people who kind of like massive advances in convolutional neural networks for dealing with image data, in recurrent neural networks, and like sure, like the landscape changed, but like I felt like around 2012 to 2014, you started developing just like kind of widespread consensus about like, if the problem looks like this is probably the right architecture. And if the thing looks spatial vaguely, like you probably needed a convnet. And if it kind of involves like inputs and outputs of varying length, you probably wanted something like an RNN or subsequently a transformer. I think like we're in this weird moment where I think the change from model to model and like, is the right thing some kind of agentic design, or is there a better way to do it with some kind of tool use, or could you get better performance via, depending on what kind of like, and at what stage do you actually think you could get better performance than you're getting from the off-the-shelf models by incorporating like the feedback that you're getting in your product? I don't think that there's the same degree of consensus among people of like two very strong engineers would look at the same problem and have the same instinct about like what's going to get. And so maybe one way that I deal with that often is I think you just need to have some amount of friendly like co-opetition within a company. Like I'll have moments where like we're trying to build a capability and I honestly don't know will a different pattern of like maybe reasoning models are going to get us like the extra squeeze, or maybe actually like RLHF against like the feedback signal that we're getting from human raters from our customers, is that's actually what's going to take over and displace those models. And if I feel like if it's not an important part of the product, who gives a shit? Focus on something else. But if it's like the most important like central core capability of your product and you don't know, then I think the only responsible thing is to place both bets simultaneously. And that often ends up being useful. Like I think those kinds of parallel development processes aren't always purely competitive, in that there I think is some amount of shared learning. the two teams that are trying to get to the same capability through different paths often still need to share a lot of infrastructure around, which data should they be looking at and which evaluation suite, and if they're building out LLM judges or something like that, the evaluation suite might be shared among them. So, but and I don't know, and maybe it's not so wildly different from what we were doing before. Like even if before you were like, oh, I thought I was going to build this with something in the family of, I don't know, some older, some down the middle, like neural network training algorithms, still like you're going to have, in the past, you would have had, 100 different bets about what is the right objective function or something like that, or what is the right way to curate data. So I think like that kind of like iteration always involves some amount of, I don't know, genetic process.
No, like, look, when the stakes are high, it's a very interesting strategy to de-risk. Okay, last question, because that went by really fast. 30 seconds or less. There's a lot of founders in the audience today, and you've experienced a lot in the last 2 years. Last 7, but very, very crunch in the last 2. You can either say, what's one mistake you've made and learned from, or your best piece of advice to a founder today?
I think maybe the best piece of advice is, I think your instinct as a founder is to try to like founder energy your way into solving problems all over your organization. And I think a realization that many of us come to too late is that like the founders can't be the only people providing that energy. And I think too often we index on like different kind of measures of experience or aptitude that don't necessarily capture that the certain like je ne sais quoi of like will run through walls, like will go to sleep thinking about the problem and waking up thinking about the problem, like will have that kind of like feeling of agency that they'll like live and die by the outcome, that they will not kind of like just do the narrow thing that you've told them to do. And oftentimes the people who have that like maybe don't look, they don't have maybe the same kind of pedigree because they burned a bunch of years trying to found companies themselves as opposed to like getting promoted at Google or something like that. And so I think like recognizing that you need distributed agency throughout a company, and like your maybe biggest job, like every time you hire a PM, every time you hire someone to own an important AI project, anytime, like what I think you're looking for is like owner operator energy. And I think it's something that it's very hard to bake into a hiring rubric. And it's very hard to it requires some humility to recognize that you need that in other people and not just like yourself.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zack.